Hello, I'm Tim, and in the next few minutes I'll be showing you how to set up and use your taper tools on a table saw. These taper tools will also work on 12-inch or larger disc sanders. In order to use the taper tools on a table saw, you will need a sanding disc. This is a 10-inch sanding disc. It's an 1/8 of an inch steel plate. You will need some sandpaper, some self-adhesive sandpaper. This is 10-inch. In my area, it's much easier to find 9-inch, so that's what I'm using. If you're going to just do nocks and tips, then 80 grit works just fine. If you're going to be using the barrel taper tool, then you need to use 120 grit. If you don't have a sanding plate, you can do a search on the internet for a 10-inch table saw sanding disc, and you'll be able to find those in several places. They're about $20 a piece. Our first task is to get the guide fitted into the slot. If the guide fits, then you're good to go. If it doesn't, you can take and sand the short side or run it back through a table saw and get it to fit in the guide or in the slot. Then we'll take a little wood glue. Put the guide back in the slot. We'll take our wedges, put those in there, push them in good and tight. Then we're going to let that dry for a few minutes, and we'll be ready to start adjusting our taper tool. Now that the glue has dried on the guide, I'm going to check it for fit. We'll just slide that back and forth a few times. It fits pretty tight, and we don't want it that tight. So what I'm going to do is use a piece of sandpaper. This is 80 grit. There's some dark areas on the guide, and I'm going to sand those off. And we'll recheck that. Got just a little bit of dark area here. Get rid of that. Now the guide slides freely in the slot. We don't want it sloppy, but we want it to be able to move very easily. Now we'll attach the taper tool to the guide. To adjust the taper tool to the sanding disc, you'll need an 11/32 field tipper or blunt and a 23/64 field tip or blunt. We're going to put the 11/32 in this end of the taper tool, push down this corner, push down on the opposite corner for here. We're going to raise the sanding disc all the way up. We're going to push the taper tool so that the field tip touches the sanding disc. Snug that up. We're going to come down here. We're going to put a piece of paper, or 3 or 4 pieces of paper rather, between the field tip and the disc. We'll snug that up. Now we need to readjust this end. I can hear the sanding disc just touching the field tip, so that's perfect. Tighten these up. We're ready to taper our first shaft. So what we will do is put the shaft inside of our rubber gripper tool. I'm going to use a cordless drill. That works very well. If you're going to use a corded electric drill, don't spin it at full speed. It spins a little bit fast. When I start the arrow shaft into the guide, I want to start turning the shaft like this. If you don't spin that shaft before it hits the sanding disc, you're going to put a flat spot on the shaft and you can't get that sanded out. When we start the shaft into the guide, we want the stop lined up right at the far edge of the sanding disc. So now we're going to check that taper diameter. What I did is just use the chuck of the drill because it's a little quicker. I'm not going to save this shaft, so even though I'm going to damage that end a little bit, I'm going to do that for my setup. So we'll take an 11/32 field tip, put it on here and check it. It looks and feels a little bit big, so we're going to readjust that. So I'm not tight there to the disc. All right, tighten that down again, and we'll run another taper. So we'll check the diameter of that. It feels pretty good. If you want to be very precise, you could use some calipers. I've done that here, and I'm actually within 5/1000ths of an inch, and so that's plenty close enough. Now what I want to do is lengthen the taper. So what I'm going to do is adjust this cam, loosen the thumb screw and move the cam a little bit. What happens when you move the cam, it moves the small portion of the taper tool closer to the sanding disc. We'll do that, snug it down, and do another taper. I'm going to check that taper with a 5/16 knock. I've still got quite a ways to go, so I'm going to readjust the cam and taper that again. And check with the knock again. I'm still a little bit bigger than I want to be, not a lot. I'm going to make one more adjustment. We'll check the taper one more time. So this end is exactly where I would like it to be. So at this point in time, I'm done adjusting this end of the tool. If the taper is not exactly the way you want it, you can spend some more time and adjust it the same way I've been showing you to adjust the tool. Just do it in very small increments. Now that our taper tool has been adjusted for diameter at the far end, we're going to adjust it for the length of the taper. If you have a stain shaft like this, it's real easy to see the length of the taper. You probably don't have those. And so what you can do is take a pencil and make some pencil marks along the shaft. That way, as you adjust the taper length, you'll be able to tell how far that taper is going. If you don't have those lines, it's almost impossible to see the taper on a raw shaft. When I initially set up the taper tool to the sanding disc, I used a 23/64 blunt at this end and 5 sheets of paper to space that out. So I'm going to change that. What I'm going to do is use 3 sheets of paper. And we'll give that a try. That's the first adjustment I want to make. By moving the taper tool closer to the sanding disc, I will make this first taper a little bit longer. And what I'm trying to do is get that first adjustment so that my taper is a little bit shorter than what my final taper wants to be. This taper length is just about where I want it to be, and so now what we'll do is start making our final adjustments. We're going to use the cam at this end to do that. I'm going to move that just a little ways, and then I'll taper it again and see what our length adjustment is. Another inch or so, and if I want to make that longer, I just move my cam a little bit further. And I can make it a little longer still. And so there you have it. We've got a 12-inch long taper, but I did exactly what I've been saying not to do. You don't make big incremental changes, and I did that. And so now I've got a very unsmooth taper here, and that's not going to work. So to fix that, One thing I'm going to do is flip the arrow around and redo it. I can also cut this shaft off and reuse that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this back to square. I'm going to use my blunt again. And I'm going to go back to my original setting. So now I'll go cut off the shaft and taper this again. Now that our adjustments have been made, we'll try the taper again. Now I have a shaft with about a 10-inch taper. That's more than long enough for me. If you don't want your taper quite that long, you just use the cam and just don't adjust it quite as far. Now I'm going to taper an 11/32 shaft and compare the taper length on the two. The length of the taper on these two shafts is different. The 23/64 is much longer. At the knock end, the diameter is the same. Once you have the end of the tool here set up, it will always taper that diameter to the same, whether it's an 11/32 shaft or 23/64 shaft or even a 3/8 inch dowel. This end is used to control the length. Using the same setting, the larger the diameter of the shaft, the longer the taper will be. And so if you're going to be changing back and forth between 11/32 and 23/64, you will want to readjust the taper tool with your field tip or blunt and your pieces of paper. This taper tool is set up and I'm ready now to taper my finished shafts. As you're setting up your taper tool, just make sure to move everything in small increments. Take your time and you'll be able to get your taper tool set up and adjust it exactly the way you want it. There are three things you can do to cause problems when you're tapering your shafts. On all of these shafts that I used, I did not straighten them. They, for the most part, were straight enough. This particular shaft is very crooked right here, and so as I was tapering it, it was flopping around in the slot, and it caused some flat spots. You can see the little fingers of stain. in between each finger is a flat spot. I also spun the drill as fast as I could, which made the problem even worse. And I spun the drill in a clockwise direction, and that doesn't work as well as if you spin it in a counterclockwise position. So to get good tapers on your shafts, make sure they're straight before you taper them. Spin the drill at a moderate rate of speed, and also rotate it counterclockwise. That way you will get your best results. My taper tool is now adjusted, and I've got some straight shafts, so I'm going to want to taper some. Put some pencil marks along here so I know how long my taper is. I'm going to readjust my tool. I want to be at 1130 seconds at this end. I'm not sure how big the diameter is on this shaft, so I'm going to move this in just a bit, and then I'll taper that shaft and see where I'm at. The taper here on the tip is very, very close to what I want. I might want to have that a little bit smaller, so I'll adjust the tool for that. My taper here isn't quite as long as I wanted it to be, so I'm going to adjust this end also. And I'll put some fresh pencil marks on here and taper that again. So my tip is good. I'm still not quite as long as I want to be here, so I'm going to make one more adjustment and get that taper just a little bit more. So now the length of my taper is what I want it to be. The tip is the diameter I want it to be. I've got some pencil mark and some graphite on here, and I'll take a piece of 120 or 150 grit sandpaper and lightly sand that off, and then I'll go ahead and finish up the other end. I've now cleaned up the tip taper with a little light sanding. At this point in time, you would be ready to taper all the shafts that you want to, a dozen, 2 dozen, 100 if you want, and the taper will be identical in all of those. I'm going to taper the knock end now, so I'll make my adjustment here. I'm not going to go quite all the way. I'm going to sneak up on it. Check the taper. I've still got a distance to go, So I'll reset and do that again. Now my knock taper area is right where I want to be. The taper tool is now adjusted to taper your shafts down to 5/16 of an inch. And so at this point in time, you can taper the rest of your dozen arrows, or 2 dozen or 100, however many you want to do at this point. If you are going to double taper your shafts, the sequence that you do the tapering in is important. The little gripper tool, once the shaft is down to 5/16 of an inch, just will not hold that shaft. So it's important that you taper the big end first and then taper your knock end. The gripper will hold this end, and that will work fine for you. Once you're done tapering your shafts, what you'll want to do is check these 2 thumb screws, make sure they're real good and tight, and then you can put your taper tool away. You can hang it on the wall, you can put it in a drawer, put it on a workbench, whatever you're going to do. A few weeks or months later, you're going to want to taper some more shafts. And you go ahead and put the taper tool back on the table saw. What I would recommend is that you reset the cams to exactly square before you start tapering, and then take a shaft and sneak up on those dimensions again. Adjust the cams a little bit at a time. Make sure that things haven't gotten out of adjustment. If you plan to only taper 1 diameter of shaft and you're not going to be switching back and forth, what you can do is take the taper tool off, turn it over, drill and countersink a hole at each end of the guide and insert a wood screw. Then the next time you go to put the taper tool back on the table saw, it will be in perfect adjustment. Even though you've fastened your guide to the taper tool and you have put your taper tool away with the final adjustments from making your last set of shafts, once you put this away and then come back a few weeks or months or whatever it is later, set it back on the table saw, I would recommend that you adjust those cams a little bit, both ends, before you taper your first shaft. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and taper a shaft, check the dimensions, make sure everything's correct. There is the possibility that your sanding plate may be tilted a little bit differently than what it was before, or something else is out of adjustment. So check before you run a lot of shafts through so you don't ruin any shafts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your interest in Tim's Taper Tools.